Long Tan is the legend everyone knows. But there is another battle, far more brutal, lasting 26 days and nights, and claiming more Australian lives than any other encounter in the war. This was the debut of 50-ton Centurion tanks in the jungle, a place where artillerymen lowered their barrels to fire point blank at an enemy just meters away, and where Splintex steel arrows were unleashed to stop endless human waves. This was no skirmish. This was a head-on collision between Australia's elite and the North Vietnamese Army's finest divisions. Are you ready to enter the firebase hell of Coral Balmoral? In May 1968, the dust from the Tet Offensive had barely settled when North Vietnamese Army, NVA, commanders began preparing for a second decisive blow against Saigon. To counter this, the 1st Australian Task Force, 1ATF, was deployed north of the capital into Biên Hòa Province. Their objective was Operation Toan Thang Hoai, to establish a series of fire support bases, FSBs, that would serve as corks in the bottle, intercepting NVA regiments as they retreated or regrouped for their next strike. The Australians chose two strategic locations, codenamed FSB Coral and FSB Balmoral. On paper, the mission seemed like a standard blocking operation. Military intelligence suggested that while enemy activity was present, the area was primarily a transit corridor for small guerrilla units. There was little indication that the Australians were about to plant their flags directly atop the main infiltration routes of two elite divisions, the NVA 7th and 9th Divisions. The arrival at FSB Coral on May 12th was plagued by logistical chaos. Because of delays in helicopter insertions and dense vegetation, the base was only partially established by sunset. Unlike the textbook defensive perimeters the Australians were famous for, Coral was a fragmented collection of gun pits and shallow scrapes. Most of the infantry was still out on patrol, leaving the core of the base, the heart where the heavy artillery sat, dangerously exposed. The soldiers were exhausted, having spent the day clearing landing zones in the sweltering heat, and many had not yet dug their pits to the required depth. What the Australians didn't know was that they were being watched. Thousands of NVA regulars were already concealed in the surrounding scrub, their scouts marking the exact coordinates of the Australian gun positions. The NVA commanders saw a rare opportunity, a prestigious Allied unit caught in the open, with its primary weapon, the artillery, vulnerable to a swift, overwhelming ground assault. As darkness fell over the Biên Hòa bush, a deceptive silence took hold. The Australians, usually the masters of the night, were about to experience a role reversal. They were no longer the hunters, they were the targets. At 3:01 a.m., the silence was not just broken, it was obliterated. A massive barrage of rocket and mortar fire began to walk across the base, signaling the start of a 26-day ordeal that would become the bloodiest and most sustained chapter in Australian military history. The quiet mission had vanished, replaced by the opening salvos of a forgotten hell. At 03 Surin on May 13, the darkness at FSB Coral erupted into a terrifying symphony of fire. The initial North Vietnamese barrage was not just a distraction, it was a precision strike aimed at paralyzing the base. Rockets and mortars slammed into the command post and the mortar lines, but the primary target was the 102 Field Battery. As the shells landed, hundreds of NVA regulars from the 141st Regiment rose from the tall grass, charging toward the Australian perimeter under the cover of their own falling steel. The situation was catastrophic. Because the base had only been occupied for a few hours, the perimeter wire was incomplete, and many of the infantry units were positioned too far out to intercept the initial rush. The NVA troops, moved with a speed and aggression that stunned the defenders, quickly swarmed over the shallow pits of 102 Battery. For the first time since the Second World War, Australian gunners found themselves in the middle of a frantic, close-quarters infantry battle to save their cannons. As the enemy surged into the gun positions, the artillerymen, trained to fire at targets miles away, became frontline infantry. They grabbed their F-1 submachine guns and SLRs, engaging in a desperate brawl over the sandbags. One of the howitzers was captured and temporarily occupied by NVA troops, who began using it as cover to fire into the rest of the base. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, the screams of the wounded, and the blinding flashes of grenades. "The bastards were right on top of us," one gunner later recalled. "You couldn't see them until they were 5 meters away, and then it was just a matter of who was faster with the trigger." Realizing the battery was about to be completely overrun, the Australians performed a feat of raw courage. While some gunners held off the enemy with small arms, others worked the remaining 100 NVA howitzers. In a move of sheer desperation, they leveled the massive barrels horizontally, pointing them directly at the ranks of charging NVA soldiers just 30 to 50 meters away. They weren't firing at a coordinate. They were firing point blank into the human wave. The muzzle blasts from the cannons were so powerful, they knocked the gunners backward and momentarily blinded everyone in the vicinity. The high explosive shells tore through the charging ranks, creating a momentary vacuum in the enemy's momentum. This brutal direct-fire defense bought the Australians the seconds they needed to regroup. Despite the chaos, the gunners of 102 Battery refused to abandon their posts, clinging to their steel beasts in a midnight hell that had turned their support base into a slaughterhouse. As the NVA continued to pour into the gaps of the unfinished perimeter, the Australian gunners of 102 Battery realized that standard high-explosive shells were no longer enough. The enemy was so close that the blast radius of a traditional shell risked killing the defenders along with the attackers. In this moment of extreme peril, the order was given to load the Splintex rounds, a specialized, terrifying canister shot designed specifically for close-range defense. A Splintex shell, officially the XM546 Beehive round, did not explode like a typical artillery shell. Instead, it acted like a giant shotgun. Upon leaving the muzzle, the casing would rupture, releasing approximately 8,000 tiny steel flechettes, 1-inch-long arrows with barbed tails. These flechettes traveled at supersonic speeds, fanning out into a lethal cone of spinning metal that could shred everything in its path. The Australian gunners leveled their 105mm howitzers once more. The command was zero muzzle, meaning the shell would detonate the moment it left the barrel. The roar was cataclysmic. A deafening crack signaled the release of tens of thousands of steel arrows into the darkness. The effect on the charging NVA ranks was instantaneous and gruesome. The wall of steel did not just stop the attackers, it practically evaporated the first and second waves of the assault. In the flickering light of flares, the scene was a nightmare. The flechettes were designed to tumble through the air, creating a scything effect that could penetrate the thickest tropical undergrowth and the most determined infantry charge. The NVA soldiers, who had been seconds away from seizing the entire battery, found themselves caught in a wind of metal. Those who weren't killed instantly were forced to retreat back into the scrub, their momentum shattered by the sheer mechanical violence of the Splintex rounds. It wasn't like a normal explosion, a veteran gunner whispered during a debrief. It was a hiss, a giant metallic hiss that followed the bang. And then, silence. For a few seconds, nothing moved in front of the gun. The use of Splintex at FSB Coral was a turning point. It proved to the North Vietnamese commanders that the Australians were prepared to use every tool in their arsenal to hold the ground. Even as their comrades fell and their pits were swarmed, the gunners stayed with their pieces, loading these beehive rounds with shaking hands in the pouring rain. The tiny steel arrows of the Splintex rounds became the silent saviors of the 102 Battery, carving a bloody sanctuary out of the chaos of the midnight assault and ensuring that the heart of the firebase continued to beat. The relief provided by the Splintex rounds was only temporary. The NVA, displaying a terrifying tenacity, regrouped and launched yet another wave of assaults. By 04:00 a.m., the situation at FSB Coral had reached its most critical point. The enemy had successfully bypassed the outer pits and was now inside the wire in significant numbers. North Vietnamese soldiers were crawling among the Australian bunkers, tossing grenades and utilizing the darkness to sow total confusion. In the desperate environment of the command post, the Australian officers faced a choice that is every commander's nightmare. The enemy was so deeply integrated into their positions that conventional defense was no longer possible. Major Ian Whitehead and the forward observation officers knew there was only one way to flush the NVA out. They had to call for danger-close fire from the supporting batteries at nearby bases and the remaining functional guns at Coral. Danger close is a clinical military term for a visceral reality. It means raining high-explosive shells onto your own coordinate. The Australian infantrymen were ordered to get as deep into their pits as possible, pressing their faces into the red dirt and covering their heads with their arms. From across the dark landscape, the 105mm howitzers and heavy mortars began to fire. The shells screamed overhead and detonated with a bone-jarring thud crack directly on top of the Australian bunkers. The ground heaved like the deck of a ship in a storm. For the Australians huddled in their holes, the experience was a sensory overload of heat, dust, and the deafening pressure of the blasts. They could hear the shrapnel pinging off the steel barrels of their own cannons and the screams of the NVA soldiers who were caught in the open above them. This was a supreme test of the steel nerves of the Australian soldier. It required an absolute, unwavering trust in the skill of their gunners. If a single shell was off target by even 20 meters, it would wipe out their own men. But the precision of the Royal Australian Artillery was flawless. The shells acted like a giant broom, sweeping the surface of the firebase clean of the enemy, while the Australians remained protected in the womb of the earth. As the smoke cleared from the internal bombardment, the NVA assault had been decapitated. The hugging tactic, where the enemy stayed close to Allied lines to avoid airstrikes, had been defeated by the Australians' willingness to call fire on themselves. When the sun began to rise over the charred remains of the firebase, the men of Coral emerged from the dirt, deafened and shaken, but still in possession of their guns. They had survived the fireball in the dark by turning their greatest weapon into their own shield. Following the near disaster at Coral, the Australian command realized that the North Vietnamese were operating with a level of firepower and coordination that required a more aggressive response. The decision was made to deploy the Centurion tanks of C Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment. This was a historic move. Many Allied commanders had previously doubted that these 50-ton, British-made heavy monsters could operate in the soft, unpredictable terrain of the Vietnamese bush. By May 24th, as the Australians established a sister base, FSB Balmoral, the Centurions arrived. Their presence changed the psychological landscape of the battle instantly. While the M113 APCs used at Long Tan were essentially armored battle taxis, the Centurion was a true predator. It featured thick armor plating that could withstand most small arms fire and a 20-pounder main gun that could level a bunker in a single shot. The North Vietnamese, however, were not intimidated. On the night of May 25th, the NVA 165th Regiment launched a ferocious assault on Balmoral. Their goal was to prove that their RPG-7, B-40, B-41 rocket-propelled grenades could neutralize the Australian armor. As the bugles sounded and the human waves surged forward, the tanks became the center of a chaotic, fire-lit struggle. The coordination between the Centurions and the infantry was a masterclass in modern warfare. The tanks didn't just sit still as static pillboxes. They moved aggressively within the perimeter, using their massive searchlights to blind the oncoming NVA infantry. When the enemy tried to swarm the tanks to plant satchel charges, the Australian infantrymen, positioned in trenches between the tanks, scythed them down with SLR fire, protecting the soft sides of the steel giants. In return, the Centurions provided a terrifying canister fire. Similar to the Splintex artillery rounds, the tanks fired shells that turned their main guns into massive shotguns, spraying thousands of metal pellets across the front of the wire. The NVA troops, who were accustomed to fighting infantry and light vehicles, found themselves facing a literal wall of moving steel that their rockets struggled to penetrate. The Centurions at Balmoral did more than just hold the line. They broke the NVA's spirit. The sight of the monsters emerging from the smoke, largely indifferent to the rocket hits that scorched their paint, sent a clear message. The Australians had brought a level of industrial strength violence that the NVA could not match in a direct assault. Balmoral became a fortress that would not fall, anchored by the iron weight of the Centurions and the unbreakable will of the men who fought alongside them. Beyond the adrenaline of the ground assaults, the Battle of Coral Balmoral evolved into a brutal test of human endurance. It was no longer just a tactical clash. It was a psychological war fought in the grueling heat of the day and the terrifying uncertainty of the night. For 26 days, the men at these fire bases lived under a constant, rhythmic rain of North Vietnamese fire. This wasn't the hit-and-run harassment of guerrillas, but the sustained, calculated bombardment of a professional army determined to break the Australian spirit. The NVA utilized a siege mentality. They knew they couldn't always overrun the base, so they aimed to starve the Australians of sleep and sanity. Day and night, the thump of enemy mortars and the whoosh of 122mm rockets became the soundtrack of life at Coral. Soldiers lived in a permanent state of hypervigilance. Every snap of a twig or rustle of the elephant grass triggered a surge of cortisol. Sleep was snatched in 20-minute intervals, often in the mud at the bottom of a trench with a rifle pressed against the chest. The environmental conditions added to the psychological toll. The Biên Hòa Province was a pressure cooker of humidity. During the day, the sun beat down on the cleared, red earth of the fire base, reflecting heat like an oven. The men, caked in sweat and dust, had to repair their bunkers and string more barbed wire, knowing that everything they built might be blown apart by sunset. There was no rear area at Coral. Every square inch was the front line. You stop being afraid after the first week, one veteran sergeant recalled. You just become hollow. You watch the rockets come in like falling stars and you just hope it hits the guy next to you instead of your own hole. That's the psychological trap of the firebase. This mental fatigue led to the famous 1,000-yard stare, a vacant, unfocused gaze seen in the eyes of men who had witnessed too much industrial-scale violence. Yet despite the exhaustion, the Australian discipline did not crack. The steel nerves of the ANZACs were maintained through a grim, dark humor and the constant presence of their officers, who insisted on routine even in the middle of a graveyard. They cleaned their weapons, shared their meager rations, and waited. The NVA commanders had hoped that the constant pressure would lead to a unit collapse, but they had underestimated the stubbornness of the Australian character. While the North Vietnamese were counting on the Australians' nerves to fail, the Australians were simply getting used to the hell. They transformed from weary soldiers into a hardened, reactive force that functioned on instinct and brotherhood, proving that while you can shell a man's position, you cannot easily shell his resolve. By the time the guns finally fell silent at Coral and Balmoral in early June 1968, the landscape resembled a scene from the Somme rather than the lush Vietnamese tropics. The red soil was a cratered wasteland, littered with the jagged remnants of thousands of artillery shells, scorched tank tracks, and the discarded remnants of 26 days of nonstop combat. The Australians had held the line, but the cost was the highest ever paid by the nation in a single operation during the Vietnam War. The statistical weight of the sacrifice was somber. 25 Australians had been killed and nearly 100 wounded. For a force of Australia's size, these were staggering numbers. The infantry battalions, particularly 1 RAR and 3 RAR, had been stretched to their absolute limits, while the 102 Field Battery had survived an ordeal that would become a legendary chapter in the history of the Royal Regiment of Australian Artillery. On the other side of the wire, the carnage was even more profound. The North Vietnamese Army, despite their tactical brilliance and fanatical bravery, had paid a devastating price for their attempt to overrun the firebases. While official counts were difficult in the chaotic jungle, it is estimated that over 300 NVA soldiers were killed and hundreds more wounded. The perimeter fences of Coral and Balmoral were grisly testaments to the wall of steel draped with the bodies of those who had tried to storm the Australian guns. The aftermath of the battle was a time of grim reflection. There were no victory parades in the mud. Instead, there was the exhausting work of identifying the fallen and clearing the battlefield. The Australian soldiers, their uniforms tattered and their faces etched with a 1,000-yard stare, moved with the slow, deliberate pace of men who had aged decades in less than a month. They had defended the gateway to Saigon, successfully intercepting the NVA regiments and preventing a second general offensive from reaching the capital's heart. This victory was not measured in land gained, for the fire bases were eventually dismantled and the bush reclaimed the red dirt, but in strategic resilience. The Australians had proven they could survive and win a conventional, high-intensity battle against the NVA's best divisions. They had faced the fireball in the dark and did not blink. The sacrifice at Coral Balmoral ensured that the NVA would never again underestimate the lethality of an Australian firebase. The price was blood, paid in full by a generation of young men who transformed two obscure map coordinates into hallowed ground. For decades, the Battle of Coral Balmoral remained a ghost in the Australian national consciousness, a forgotten hell overshadowed by the singular, cinematic fame of Long Tan. While Long Tan was a sharp, dramatic encounter that fit the narrative of an underdog victory, Coral Balmoral was a grueling, industrial-scale siege that lacked a neat conclusion. Yet for the veterans who survived those 26 days of fire, This was the moment the Australian military truly proved its mettle against the full weight of a professional, regular army. The primary reason for its long-standing forgotten status was the nature of the war back home. By May 1968, the Australian public's support for the Vietnam War was fracturing. The news coming out of Biên Hòa was not of a heroic skirmish, but of a bloody, grinding war of attrition. The government, wary of rising anti-war sentiment, did not amplify the scale of the sacrifice at Balmoral. As a result, the men returned to a country that was increasingly indifferent or even hostile to their service, and their titanic struggle was buried in the classified archives of Canberra. However, in the world of military doctrine, the legacy of Balmoral is immortal. It is studied today as a masterclass in defensive fire support. The battle proved that the Australian air mobile firebase concept was viable, provided it was anchored by the raw courage of the gunners and the iron fist of the Centurion tanks. It redefined the relationship between different branches of the service, showing that when infantry, armor, and artillery function as a single organism, they can withstand a force 10 times their size. It wasn't until 2018, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, that the Australian government finally awarded the unit citation for gallantry to the participants of Balmoral. It was a belated recognition of the steel nerves shown in 1968, a formal admission that these men had faced the most sustained and intense combat of the entire war. The legacy of Balmoral is a reminder that glory is not always found in the quick victory, but in the quiet, grim determination to hold the line when the world is exploding around you. The jungle ghosts of Long Tan may have the fame, but the Ironmen of Balmoral have the respect of every professional soldier who understands the true cost of holding a firebase in hell. They prove that the Australian soldier does not break. He simply digs deeper, waits for the barrage to end, and prepares for the next charge.